exhibition at the Impact Center that's actually related to the event that we're staging tonight. It's also dealing with, among others, how political subcultures influence day-to-day politics. But tonight's event also is connected with a web project that we've been staging called Radicalization by Design. It's online, you can all watch it. It's on the website of us, Electronica, and it's also on the Impact website. And we'll be discussing and continuing the discussions from that web project. We have a live online panel tonight with guests that participated also in the web project, and we have a few extra guests that will participate online. The web project, Radicalization by Design, was all about how social media and the way they are structured influence public debate and how they may contribute to extreme political polarization. As documented in journalistic accounts of the alt-right, radicalization and conspiracy theory rabbit holes leading, for example, from YouTube and Instagram to fringe sites like 4chan.
Hi, so my name's Mark Tudors. I'll be co-moderating this evening with Aryan, and our guests have some insights into these issues that we explored in the web project, and in particular, we could say that these communities that that Aryan just spoke of engage in a kind of speech, an online speech that one of our guests speaks about as extreme speech. It's something like hate speech, but it also involves kind of an ambiguity and irony, and as academics might say, it's sort of complicated. So we'll hear about that this evening from Sahana Udupa. And the web project also involved a dialogue on the topic of deplatforming, which is a term that we could use for kind of content moderation where community is removed from a social media platform. And that was actually a topic of discussion between two of our guests who are joining us here this evening. Richard Rogers from the University of Amsterdam and Bharath Ganesh from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And so we'll have a discussion on that topic of deplatforming later on this evening. Our fourth guest offers us some insight into the way that content moderation works from a kind of more technical perspective. Professor Joanna Bryson from the Hertie School of Governance has a PhD in computer science from MIT, and she'll offer us some insights into the sort of technicalities of this, as well as getting into a discussion subsequently about the more ethnographic perspective from a humanities point of view. I would like to also point out one interesting detail actually about Joanna's biography. She was involved with an advisory panel for Google, an advisory panel by the name of the Advanced, Joanna will probably correct me, hopefully, the Advanced Technology...
External Advisory Council.
Thank you, Joanna. Which, as we'll hear later, was involved in a kind of a complex political deplatforming of sorts as well. So that's something that we can get into in the structure of this evening's panel. I'll actually come to the structure, but first I'll pass the mic back to Aryan.
Yeah, so in tonight's event, we'll continue our discussions about deplatforming, but we'll also address another issue, the so-called cancel culture, which we see as referring more generally to the ways in which the practices of cultural gatekeeping, whether editors, curators, journalists, or even scientists, are currently being brought to the forefront of public attention when it comes to questions of what to do with extreme opinions and controversial points of view, such as, for example, those of the alt-right. These are highly complex issues, of course, and we do not have a one-size-fits-all solution for here, and we don't pretend that we'll come with such a solution. So, in brief, tonight we'll talk about artificial intelligence and human decision-making in relation to platform governance, and we'll talk about the ethical challenges and responsibilities facing the people in charge of these platforms. Challenges and responsibilities which are also facing journalists, the academic community, and programmers in the art, as the curators of the media landscape and the public debate. Our aim here is to clearly articulate these challenges and responsibilities, and in fact, to create a platform for the discussions about deplatforming.
So the structure of this evening breaks down into 4 parts. We'll begin with about a half an hour for the intro section, and that will involve 2 10-minute presentations by Joanna and Sahana, beginning with Sahana, and then a brief response by Richard and Bharath. That will be the conclusion of the first part. The second part of the discussion will then focus on the question of online governance, content moderation, and the sort of ethnographic, anthropological, and technical aspects of what we've referred to as deplatforming. Then the third part of the discussion will move into the more ethical questions of what we've heard called cancel culture, issues around free speech, and so forth. And then in the fourth section, there'll be an opportunity for those of you at home who will be able to ask questions, and then we'll engage with your questions from the audience. There is an email address for that, I believe.
Yeah. So in this last part of the program, you can send your questions to the simple email address called questions@impact.nl. Impact is, of course, written with a K, so questions@impact.nl. You can send the questions whenever you want, and at the end of this program, we'll take some of those, and we hope to take some of those and include them in our discussion. So now it's time to introduce our first speaker.
Yeah, so it's my great pleasure to introduce Sahana Udupa, who I've had an opportunity to interact with over the past couple of years over email, but only just now met in sort of as close as we get these days to face-to-face, I suppose. Sahana is putting together a book on extreme speech, a volume that she's brought together a number of really interesting perspectives, which we will hear something about, I believe, this evening. She's a professor at the Ludwig Maximilian School in Munich. She's a professor of Media Anthropology. And Sahana, I would like to, for the audience and us here as well, to offer you a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I will start right away with my presentation. Okay. So thank you once again for having me here. What we've been doing in our extreme speech project is to look at extreme speech practices in a variety of contexts by taking a global comparative approach that combines ethnographic fieldwork with text-based analysis and computational methods. And in doing this, with several collaborating colleagues and co-authors, Eugenio Gagliardo, Peter Herwig, Matti Pohjonen, and others, we depart from the dominant legal normative definitions of hate speech and the idea that all we need to do is isolate and combat vitriolic speech based on the assumption that we already know how it looks like and what needs to be done. Extreme speech theory takes a step back and stresses the importance of comprehension over classification. This means paying attention to local context and understanding actors who are involved in extreme speech practices. In my study, for instance, I found at least 5 prototypes of right-wing extreme speech actors in India. There are middle-class ideological warriors who vouch by the fact that they are volunteers through and through and they don't take a penny for their right-wing work online. But there are also actors who troll for livelihood. And then there are politically agnostic commercial digital influencers, and of course, hard-boiled political actors who try to seize voter loyalties by targeting online narratives. Similarly, when we look at how online extreme speech unfolds in Turkey, Pakistan, Kenya, and Indonesia, for example, there are intricate political scenarios of internal rivalry, sometimes within the party itself. And very important, extreme speech, by which I mean the act of stretching the legitimate boundaries of speech along the twin axes of truth, falsity, and civility, incivility, can be progressive in some contexts, and regressive in others. But these divergent political implications of extreme speech and the need for ethnographic attention should not take our attention away from unfolding events that have ramped up vitriol and disinformation in the last 2 decades. So we define this as a conjuncture beginning from the 1990s, but precipitating at the turn of the millennium, that allowed the powerful to reject civility, deride inclusion, and attack dignity. This is a political formation whose expression and vehicle is predominantly, if not exclusively, digital. The argument is not that digital media are creating bad people or provoking extreme behaviors. Far from such psychologizing explanations, we argue that exclusionary extreme speech should be seen as a global conjuncture, a confluence of actors, effects, and affordances. And this global conjuncture is, first of all, about new styles and resources for communicating the unsayable, a kind of bare knuckles approach to speech. I have defined this as fun as a meta practice that instigates collective pleasures of transgression. And this phenomenon has been well documented in the case of white supremacists and meme cultures, for instance. And fun and digital economies of industrial scale of interaction within which it is embedded have serious implications, not because they are some peculiar kinds of communication, but precisely because they emerge from and reproduce deeper historical forces. That brings us to the second point that extreme speech theory foregrounds: the need to place contemporary developments in a longer historical timeline and the far-reaching consequences of what Mignolo calls the colonial modern metrics of power. So when we analyze white supremacist voices, we see there is a sense of dethronement that comes out of the long history of empire. And this partly explains why millionaires throw their might and money into right-wing movements in countries like Denmark and the US. They are not the disadvantaged white proletariat who have fallen on the wrong side of neoliberal economic transitions and immigration policies. And therefore, the targets of exclusionary extreme speech come marked by racialized prejudice, religious histories, and injustices of the colonial past. Now, against this vast complexity, I know Mark commented that we all like to make it very complicated as academics, but it is indeed very complicated, both these contemporary contexts as well as their deep histories. How then do we understand deplatforming? The obvious point is that because the contexts are so varied, deplatforming might work in some places, but not in others. So the biggest challenge, I would say, comes when the ruling regime is directly involved in online extreme speech practices, whether in the case of Myanmar or India. In these cases, if the platform removes some visible faces, it is likely that the ruling regime would install new faces or fire up existing ones. Moreover, it may get into a direct confrontation with social media companies as part of a complex social media management strategy. So actually, they're not fighting. The Indian government, for instance, wrote a letter to Facebook recently that it is unfairly targeting people who are right of center, although we all know, much to the contrary, there has been a cozy relationship between the right-wing regime and Facebook. Last year, hashtag Twitter insults India was making rounds. Because right-wing online users staged protests, blaming that Twitter was removing their accounts. And these episodes illustrate two key concerns about deplatforming: that it could backfire, that you would push these voices to go underground, making them even more vengeful and purposeful. In some cases, you might even make them come into existence by naming these voices as such and such. And all these are genuine concerns. But when there is sufficient mobilization already and sufficient social capital by way of online charisma or even financial might, I think deplatforming is a sure way of signaling that certain kinds of discourses are not approved. You may not be able to completely take away the oxygen supply, but you can stir them to realize there is something like oxygen supply they rely on, and that supply could go away. And this kind of defamiliarizing I would call it defamiliarizing, to make aware of what you've taken for granted. And I'm adapting what sociologist Harold Garfinkel defined as ethnomethodology. The idea is to disrupt the taken for granted everyday structures of practical action. And he called them breaching experiments. In his case, of course, it was about revealing the unspoken structures of social order that sustains action and interaction. But in the case of deplatforming, we could argue that it has a similar effect by interrupting the practical structures of extreme speech and by prompting online users to see what sustains their action, and that these structures are not a natural endowment, but something that reflects a particular social order and hence can be upturned or withdrawn. And therefore, for all these reasons, when you interrupt the infrastructure, you're not just blocking in a limited sense of regulatory control, but also stirring a consciousness and creating an awareness that something had to keep their extreme speech practices afloat rather than their own seemingly authentic ideological drive. In fact, this is even more effective when paid trolls and propagandists are involved, because deplatforming can raise the cost of online extreme speech. And for all these reasons, that the possibility to defamiliarize online structures of practical action, stirring public consciousness and raising the cost of online extreme speech, I would say deplatforming is a welcome step. It's an important form of societal signaling. And I think this societal signaling can empower many critical voices, including employees of large global corporations whose agency we are beginning to notice in the case of Facebook or Google, for example. But the big challenge is whom to deplatform. And this is a big political question and also a technical question. There is vast variation in platforms. Twitter deplatforming can be public and spectacular, but what about WhatsApp? In many countries, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Philippines, India, etc., vast networks of actual real-world people peddle and amplify animosities online. I just took this image because our digital influencer had 863 WhatsApp messages. I mean, that's the kind of busy lives they have. This was taken from an election campaign. And these are not highly visible Twitter celebrities whose expunging would lead to some kind of suffocating of extreme voices. But these are small little nodes that are up plenty and dispersed. So it could be your maternal uncle or your college friend or a neighborhood social worker now working for a local right-wing politician. They are on your WhatsApp network. They send you jokes, greetings, mourn for your loss, celebrate festivals with you, but also suddenly send politically partisan messages, dehumanizing images about religious minorities and other kinds of brazen extreme speech. And we've been tracking how this WhatsApp message travels, and we've been drawing temporal graphs, what kind of messages come and flow in these networks. And if you look at the distribution structure of WhatsApp content in a country like India, the ruling party has raised a very complex structure. On the one hand, you have the official communication channel, but it is linked to a lot of dispersed volunteers and what they call SMS. SMS is not short message services, but social media sevak. Sevak in Hindi means volunteer. So this is the sort of extremely complicated structure which blurs the boundaries between political campaigning, family messaging, and friendly banter. So what is deplatforming in these contexts? I will end this presentation with two slides, and here, even though it looks very complicated, when you look at these WhatsApp groups, you see the top users are, either one or two of them who send out a large volume of content. And this is from the WhatsApp group, but we see a similar pattern on Twitter as well. So my point here is that it is a huge challenge, no doubt. Platforms should definitely be held responsible and accountable. And one way perhaps is also to look at these top users. But what we should also do is approach this as digital practice in a holistic sense. Platforms are involved, but also different kinds of users, networks and cultures of exchange, about which I can probably comment later on during the discussion, and also the deeper histories within which they are embedded. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sahana. With us here, we have two of the speakers that were also in the Radicalization by Design web project, Bharath Ganesh over there and Richard Rogers. First, I would like to see maybe Joanna or one of the speakers here in the hall has a first response, or maybe some questions to Sahana, to your presentation. Is there anyone that has an immediate? Yeah, Richard, go ahead.
You talked about extreme speech on the one hand and deplatforming on the other, but you didn't give us the relationship between the two. And I'm curious to ask you whether and under what conditions should extreme speech be deplatformed?
Yeah, I think I mentioned that, well, extreme speech can have this effect of challenging existing status quo. And then you have really regressive forms of violent extreme speech, violence not just in terms of physical violence, but also in terms of emotional and psychological harm. So you have to really distinguish between these when you are deciding to deplatform. And that's a huge question, right? I mean, the link between, exclusionary extreme speech and the need for regulatory action has to be understood as a community-driven, people-centric kind of solution. So this is again very abstract, I understand, but in our project, the European Research Council funded project AI for Dignity, I'm trying to develop this sort of bottom-up people-centric model where we try to involve fact checkers as a kind of proxy to people's voice and triangulate that with academic intermediaries and AI developers, and thereby develop a dialogue process, a process model that is hopefully replicable at regional, local, and national levels. So by doing this, perhaps we are going to distinguish between juvenile and really funny and innocent kind of expressions and democratizing contestations and exclusionary extreme speech. So that's how I see it, because extreme speech in practice is always a slippery ground between intimidation and juvenile kind of expression and democratizing contestation. So to separate them is a huge challenge. So one way to do it is to bring these dialogue processes involving communities.
Thanks, Sahana. Maybe this is a good moment to continue a little bit of the discussion that we had in the web project, especially between Bharath and Richard. And you also already showed that a little bit in your presentation. What are the consequences of deplatforming, and when is it a good strategy or not? What are the pros and cons, and what in the end is the balance? And I think it was interesting to hear in the web project that there were some differences between Bharath and Richard, where Bharath, you were more in favor of deplatforming, and giving also, of course, some context to it and nuances, and you seem to be seeing more the problematic side of deplatforming. Maybe we could, the two of you could explain those two positions a bit, and see, and take the audience into the pros and cons of deplatforming.
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, in the web project, I kind of put forward the position that deplatforming is something that we need to take seriously. But I think it's important maybe we take a step back and we think about one of the slides that Sahana had put up. And there she had kind of traced out the different cells and different bits of that social network through which these WhatsApp messages spread. So one of the things that I think we need to think about are the different layers about not just deplatforming, but about how extreme speech actually gets platformed in the first place, right? One of the things that we talk about a lot are the ways in which the design and the software of social media platforms provide opportunities and spaces for extreme speech. So one of the really good examples of this is that after the Christchurch shooting, Facebook had said, we're going to start eliminating white supremacist content on our platform. And there was extensive amounts of white supremacist content. They said that they started taking action on it, but there was a recent report put out by the Tech Transparency Project, and they actually found that after the Christchurch shooting, Facebook's recommendation engines were still giving recommendations to people looking for white supremacist groups online, right? So one of the things we need to think about here is what are the ways in which the platforms themselves provide a platform for extremism. That's one part of this, this discussion that we need to think about. So one of the things we might want to do in terms of framing deplatforming is thinking about how do we actually try to take away those relationships? How do we try to disrupt their networks by preventing them from being able to take advantage of different kinds of techniques or affordances available on platforms? And I think another really important point that Sahana had brought up is the way that this connects with existing power structures. I think we can't really understate the extent to which platforms, especially in the United States, are worried about claims, especially from right-wing politicians, about they're censoring right-wing voices or they're canceling right-wing voices, which is obviously something we're going to come back to later. I don't think we can understate the extent to which that the power that these forces have in the United States, in India, and in many other places across the world have in actually shaping the agenda that platforms use in order to actually think about how do we even start coming up with a problem about what even gets decided to get policed, right? What kinds of extreme speech do we care about? And we've seen, especially with counterterrorism in the last 2 decades, we've seen over and over that it's usually one kind of extreme speech over others that becomes a problem. And in a certain way, we've seen that right-wing extremism has kind of become structurally exempt. And that's one of the key things that we need to think about when we're talking about deplatforming.
Richard? What?
Yeah, so in the work that I did, we asked for whom does deplatforming work? So not just does it work, but for whom does it work? Does it work for society at large? Does it work for the platforms that throw people and their content off? Does it work for the alternative platforms where the extremists go to, or others? And what we generally found was that deplatforming does a number of things to the extreme voices. First of all, when we looked at about 20 individuals who were deplatformed from Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and went to such alternative tech platforms as Telegram, Gab, Vote, BitChute, etc., what we found was that they continued to be active. So their activity did not decrease. However, their fan base was much, much smaller. And also, interestingly enough, their sort of hateful language actually mellowed. So it seemed to sort of work in the sense of it mellowed these extreme voices. When you have to ask yourself the question, well, why were they being so extreme in the first place? Were they being extreme for profit, mainly? Or were they really proper extremists in the first place if they're so mellow later? Okay, so this is another question. Secondly, we found that the platforms that threw them off, some of them they now despise. So they despise Facebook, they despise Instagram, and they're basically calling of their supporters to leave those platforms. But they still like Twitter and they still like YouTube, which gives a sort of indication of that those are still sites of excitable or extreme speech. So it worked for Facebook and it worked for Instagram, interestingly enough. And then finally, the larger question of the extent to which it works for society at large, I think that's open, and I'm a little bit more ambivalent because we have seen, so one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. We've seen many cases in history where the swinging back and forth of what constitutes and who are the people who should be silenced or could be silenced. So I'm a little bit concerned. We'll come back. We talked about to cancel culture, but I'm a little bit more ambivalent or cautious in talking about the overall effectiveness of deplatforming for society at large.
Thanks very much. For this panel, we've also prepared some video clips, and we'll show a few films that we've selected that are on this topic of radicalization by design, also for our speakers to respond to. And the first clip that we would like to show and share with you is actually a clip by Tristan Harris speaking to the Senate's Commerce Committee. Tristan Harris will speak a bit about what the technologies are behind, for instance, Facebook, the recommendation algorithms, and how this kind of leads to polarization of the users of those platforms.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. Fascinating discussion. I'd like to address an issue that I think is of profound importance to our democratic republic. And that's the fact that in order to have a vibrant democracy, you need to have an exchange of ideas and an open platform. And certainly part of the promise of the internet as it was first conceived was that we'd have this incredible universal commons where a wide range of ideas would be discussed and debated. It would be robust. And yet it seems as if we're not getting that. We're actually getting more and more siloed. Dr. Wolfram, you mentioned how people could make choices and they could live in a bubble, but at least it would be their bubble that they get to live in. But that's what we're seeing throughout our society as polarization increases. More and more folks are reverting to tribal type behavior. Mr. Harris, you talked about our medieval institutions and Stone Age minds. Tribalism was alive and well in the past, and we're seeing advances in technology in a lot of ways bring us back into that kind of tribal behavior. So my question is, to what extent is this technology actually accelerating that, and is there a way out? Yes, Mr. Harris.
Yeah, thank you. I love this question. There's a tendency to think here that this is just human nature. Now, that's just people are polarized, and this is just playing out. It's a mirror. It's holding up a mirror to society. But what it's really doing is it's an amplifier for the worst parts of us. So in the race to the bottom of the brainstem to get attention, let's take an example like Twitter. It's calculating what is the thing that I can show you that gets the most engagement. And it turns out that outrage, moral outrage, gets the most engagement. So it was found in a study that for every word of moral outrage that you add to a tweet, it increases your retweet rate by 17%. So in other words, the polarization of our society is actually part of the business model. Another example of this is that shorter, briefer things work better in an attention economy than long, complex, nuanced ideas that take a long time to talk about. And so that's why you get 140 characters dominating our social discourse. But reality and the most important topics to us are increasingly complex, while we can say increasingly simple things about them. That automatically creates polarization because you can't say something simple about something complicated and have everybody agree with you. People will, by definition, misinterpret and hate you for it. And then it's never been easier to retweet that and generate a mob that will come after you. And this has created a call-out culture and chilling effects and a whole bunch of other subsequent effects in polarization that are amplified by the fact that these platforms are rewarded to give you the most sensational stuff. One last example of this is on YouTube. Let's say we actually equalize. I know there's people here concerned about equal representation on the left and the right in media. Let's say we get that perfectly right. As recently as just a month ago on YouTube, if you did a map of the top 15 most frequently mentioned verbs or keywords in the recommended videos, they were hates, debunks, obliterates, destroys. In other words, Jordan Peterson destroys social justice warrior in video. So that kind of thing is the background radiation that we're dosing 2 billion people with. And you can hire content moderators in English and start to handle the problem, as Ms. Stamphill said. But the problem is that 2 billion people in hundreds of languages are using these products. How many engineers at YouTube speak the 22 languages of India where there's an election coming up? So that's some context on that.
So we're going to now move into the second presentation. Our next presenter is Joanna Bryson, who I already introduced briefly before, so I'll just kind of remind you. She's a professor from the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. holds a PhD in computer science from MIT. And Joanna, I would like to offer the floor to you if you are ready.
Okay, yeah, sure. I'll just share my screen too. Thanks for having me. And I will say briefly that I'm slightly terrified that you said I was the technical expert. I am an AI person here, but I'm not someone who works exactly in social media and the technology behind all these sort of filtering things we've been talking about. I've heard some of those talks, so I'll try to represent that. But anyway, let me go ahead and give you just a quick talk over the sort of some of the highlights of ideas that might be useful for the rest of this conversation, and we'll get to the conversation. So, all right, yeah, so when we're talking about artificial intelligence, which I think we will be because we're going to be talking about the role of artificial intelligence in dealing with this, we need to talk about what that even means. And so a lot of people have some misconceptions about what they might think they could get with AI. I just want to be clear that when I'm talking about intelligence, this is not my definition. It's actually a definition for the 19th century. It was agreed when they were trying to figure out how to tell which animals were more intelligent than each other. It's just the ability to do the right thing at the right time, to adjust your behavior to your context. And as such, it's a form of computation. It's a transformation of perception about the information in the current context into action. All right. So if you can accept that, which I know some people will be, oh, but there's other stuff I care about. We'll get to some of those things later. Then it's really easy to define artificial intelligence. It's the subset of all the intelligent stuff that someone deliberately made. Okay, and you can say, oh, but I used, I rolled dice, or I used uranium or something, and I had something random happen. But you still made that design decision. You have infinitely more, well, not quite infinite, almost infinitely more control over building AI than you do over, for example, having a child, right? You do get to maybe choose the partner if you're lucky, but you don't get to choose the fundamental design of a human being. So human beings, you know, we tend to have 2 arms, 2 legs, and not everybody, but, you know, we don't tend to have a lot more than that. And we, for any human, and not just a human, any like mammal, even fish, if they're a social species, if you isolate them, it's bad for them. It's stressful. They're afraid, you know, that company matters. So you cannot raise a child such that they would be happy to be isolated. Whereas you can put your computer in a safe. Nobody will care. And the computer will not care, I promise. Okay. So anyway, this thing about building something deliberately is really important. It isn't all of our intelligence. And so we do also have implicit, unconscious parts of our intelligence that we have trouble controlling too. And that's because computation is hard. So we compartmentalize. So the explicit and the deliberate are the parts for which we consider ourselves to be responsible. Now let's get on to a little bit about that. So when I talk about ethics, I'm basically talking about how a society holds itself together. And the way that societies hold themselves together is by deciding, you know, who are the people that are responsible for their actions. That is called technically the moral agents. And what are they responsible for? Normally, societies involve you being somewhat responsible for yourself, but somewhat responsible to others for themselves. But also to, like, for example, babies are almost never moral agents, but they are always moral patients. In almost every society, you really have to keep the babies alive, right? So that's a pretty fundamental little concern. All right, so I just mentioned responsibility, and I haven't mentioned yet, but some people bring it up in the context of AI trust. And I want to emphasize these are relationships we have between peers, right? More or less peers. Yes, you talk about, you know, trusting a leader, but it's not a relationship you have with an artifact, okay? An artifact can't be your peer because of that design component, right? That we have just totally different control relationships to artifacts. But an artifact can be made to be transparent. That is a choice. It's not that all AI is transparent. In fact, a lot of it is not, but it's a design decision about whether or not you make it clear, whether you show what the decisions were made, and when you put the AI together, so that you can trace whether or not that was appropriate. Did you follow due diligence? Did you follow best practice? What were the thresholds by which you checked that it was ready for release? Did you consider the consequences of its release? How did you monitor it once it is released? How do you make sure the system is still doing a good job? Now, some people will think, oh, you can't do that with AI. We already do this in well-regulated disciplines, like, for example, I'm sorry, not disciplines, sectors, like automotive. So this is perfectly doable. It's just that for some reason within AI and also within the large platforms, we haven't been doing that much yet. We probably will. Okay. All right. I will mention one other thing, which is anthropomorphism. So when you describe a non-human entity as a human, as you do when you say, oh, let's trust AI, that's a form of anthropomorphism, okay? And I want to bring up, I just added this in during the previous talk. It's really important to understand it's the flip side of dehumanizing. So it is quite striking that the First Nation that even pretended, it didn't really, it gave honorary citizenships to a robot, was one that had serious challenges with how they treated not only their own citizens, but also the many other people who they wouldn't allow to have citizenship in their country, despite having been there for some time. All right, so a little bit of science just on the side. I'm not doing nearly as beautiful a talk as the previous one, but chase my publications for more details. Social media is actually not correlated with extremism. So it isn't just the use of it that makes you extremist. There are extremists on it that can perform certain kinds of actions, but it isn't that just being on Twitter more makes you more extreme, okay? Political polarization and identity politics, and I love a lot of the stuff that Tristan Harris said, but that clip has a lot of things I strongly disagree with. It isn't just something about how you talk to each other that makes you more extremist. We know that this is very highly correlated with economic conditions. And so sometimes when people are trying to address, of course you need to talk to people and think about correct ways to talk to people. But we're trying to understand, why is it that suddenly there's like super rich people who are then funding extremists, right? Why do they fund? Well, if it's long and it's complicated, and I'll skip over it. We can talk about this more later. I want to make sure I get to the end of my talk. It is possible that indirectly the digital sphere creates inequality, mostly because distance doesn't matter as much. So that's really hard for governance, including taxation. So there's some people that just are not paying enough tax. But it's something that's happened before. It happened in the late 19th century. It probably happens over and over when we invent new technologies. We have to get on top of governing it so that we're all on a relatively level playing field and we're not having all this craziness. Okay, this is the Google's Advanced Technology External Advisory Council. I don't usually mention this. It's the first time I've ever had to build a slide of it, but I was asked to bring it up here so we could talk about a context of the first time I heard of cancel culture and deplatforming was in this context. So the idea was that it was not an ethics board. It was to bring in a bunch of people who thought really differently from the people who worked for Google. So Google worked hard. I mean, they spent a lot of money to pay other people. They didn't pay us. They paid a lot of other people to come up with great policies, and then they wanted us to kind of stress test their policies. And these people were amazing. I mean, like they have like, one person from Asia, one person from Africa. Okay. Been elected. So that would be William Burns. Yeah. And who, like I said, worked for Obama, worked for Bush. And then on the right, again, not very far on the extreme right, but working for a relatively far right think tank, right? But in fact, both, as far as I know, the first woman and the first African American who did work for that, Kay Cole James, and the two of them together had both been working on the problem of not together, they hadn't worked together yet, but James had been working with Feinstein, with the California senators, about how to handle the hacking of American elections. So that was something they had in common. So that we were never told what we were going to be working on exactly. There was going to be secret stuff and we'd be brought in and we had to fly all the way to California and whatever. So I don't know anything terribly secret. I do know that the first one was supposed to be about facial recognition, and they gave me permission to say that. I also know they chose these people because we're all kind of outspoken jerks who will say our opinion, but that we're sufficiently open-minded, they thought there was some chance we would actually come to a consensus sometimes. And so they thought that would be a process that was worth trying to facilitate to really, as I said, bullet test their projects. Okay, so how much time do I have left?
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes, okay. There's so many things I could say, but I'll just go ahead and say what I was going to say because this relates to something that was just brought up. Famously, we can use AI to do things that no individual human would easily do, like figure out who you would likely get along with. And it's actually very difficult to use social media to change people's minds about like who they would vote for. Only about 2% of people can be changed, although a lot of elections in highly polarized societies are 50-50. But on the other hand, you can figure out who you might be able to contact and convince them that they ought to take action. They ought to go out to convince them they're majority, or convince them to stay home, convince them they've been disenfranchised, convince them they shouldn't vote. So so rather than changing people's minds about who to support, you change their votes. You change whether or not they express the vote. And that's a huge problem. And if you're tired of talking about these guys, I wanted to bring this up, the WhatsApp thing. It is amazing how WhatsApp was hacked. It's supposedly peer-to-peer. You may feel like you're in some kind of private little group, but in fact, it isn't only humans, although yes, you can do this with humans. And almost all of these things have been done with purely humans, pencil and paper in the past. It's just the scale. The scale is amazing. Every single WhatsApp group was compromised, that anybody could get in touch with, was compromised in the Brazil election in 2018. So the scale at which some of it was human, some of it was sock puppets, some of it was bots, that they were able to propagate the media they created was amazing. And I recommend this paper if you want to read about that. So yeah, we also have worries about compromising not only the autonomy of individuals, but also of nations. And I just, and that can happen if you're not paying attention. You can do it yourself. Or maybe you don't think that people matter anymore. Maybe you don't think you need that many people, and it doesn't matter that half your country isn't getting adequate support. But we saw, like, the UN came in and noticed, like Britain, that they were starving their people, and the people in London hadn't noticed. That was just insane. I am British, incidentally, despite my accent. Okay, and yeah. Joanna, why would people do these kinds of things? Who funds these kinds of things? People who feel threatened, perhaps that have a lot of money already. It's called regulatory capture. When they realize that you might be trying to take away what they consider their liberty, then they look at ways to assault the rule of law, or at least the parts of the rule of law they don't like. Now, this may be putting them into an even worse situation. After 2 world wars and the financial crash, then the global elite said, okay, we don't want this much power if it leads to entropy. And they actually did sign up to do more redistribution. They used Bretton Woods to reduce some of the transnational extraction that had been happening. But unfortunately, we decided that wasn't a big deal after the Soviet Union ended. But I just want to, this graph here, you might be wondering, what is this graph? It's about, is your GDP helped or hurt by what? By climate change, right? So, okay, why is it that America is no longer a signatory and Russia is a signatory, but Russia's not doing a lot of work on this process, okay? So one thing you can think about war, one way to think about war is it's dismantling your enemy's infrastructure so that they lose autonomy with respect to you, so you can get your desires. And I think that's almost, when you have really high inequality, you're almost definitionally in a state of war because individuals are more important than borders. And that is something that ICT might increase. All right, so I'll stop there. And I hope that was sufficiently
thanks a lot, thanks.
And I gotta figure out how to do. Oh, I know my keyboard.
Joanna, thanks for your presentation. If there are any immediate questions or responses by the speakers here, I at least would like to have you say a little bit more about one of your statements or one of the text in your slide where you said social media is not correlated with extremism, which kind of opposes what Tristan Harris said in his presentation, and you announced that you very much disagree with a lot of what he said. but please explain us a bit more why you think social media is not correlated with extremism.
I just think that because I read the papers about it, and so people thought it did, and then if you went out and looked at them, at their actual behavior, when we're talking about just the amount of time spent on Twitter or Facebook is not correlated with how extreme your views are. All right. So there are things that some people do get radicalized there. There's no question that some people do get preyed upon and whatever. It's not that that doesn't ever happen. And maybe
Sahana
most people who get radicalized through social media. I don't know. I don't know that data. But I have seen data of just looking at the average social media user, looking at how much time they spend on it, and then how radical their ideas are, and it's not correlated. And so that's what science is for. We find out these things, right? People go out and check that. I know one person that did related work. I can't remember who did that one, but like I said, hassle me on Twitter, and I'll look up that citation for you. But one thing that was related is Andy Guess at Princeton, who showed that people tended to actually read less polarized things than they said they were reading. So he sat there in an election. He got 2,000 people they interviewed them, but then also got them to let him see their entire log, their log history, web history. And actually almost everybody was reading actually fairly moderate stuff. But it became a part of being an American that you would report yourself of reading the left or the right information. So somebody asked you, you knew what the right answer was, depending if you're Republican or Democrat.
John,
but they were actually not seeing that much stuff, with some exceptions.
Sahana, you raised your hand. Could you maybe you have a question, Sahana?
Yeah, a very quick question. When you say they, and when you say social media users, and when you say average social media user, who are these people? Where was this study conducted? Which country? Which political context?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And to be honest, most of the things that I've seen, the Brazilian study was about the only thing I read in Brazil was that particular paper. The Andrew Guess is definitely looking at the American elections because he's sitting in Princeton. So that's true.
One question I have also for you as an AI expert, also connecting a bit what you said with Tristan Harris' video. I'm very curious how much of platform moderation is done by humans deciding on something has to be categorized in a certain way, and then maybe it has to be deplatformed or not, and how much is done by AI. I mean, as far as I know, for instance, playing uncopyrighted copyrighted music on YouTube, they have an algorithm that it would detect it and it would be removed from it automatically. No human involvement there. Maybe you can tell us a bit about how you see that, the division between human intervention and AI intervention.
I'm sure somebody else here can come up with the numbers that whatever Zuckerberg most recently said. I've forgotten what his claim was about that. But I can tell you a little bit more about how that actually works. So first of all, they hire humans. Probably they don't hire nearly as many humans as they should, especially given how much money they have. But on the other hand, it's incredibly damaging work. It really, really harms you. There are things people put on the internet that seeing these images changes your life. And so so everyone is trying to find ways to limit how much harm is done to the people who are doing this content reviewing as well. But yeah, I'm sure that not enough resources are being spent on it. But anyway, there's only so much stuff that you can catch with AI. And of course, when things are taken down, like when the My Lai picture was taken down, people freak out because they're like, oh my God, that's suppressing artistic expression. It's removing history. You're hiding American atrocities. And that's correct. I'm enough of a computer scientist. I normally, my original was coming down on that side. Leave it. But of course, as was eloquently said by Sahana and my other colleagues, sometimes there have clearly been situations where deplatforming did seem to it just seemed necessary. It just seemed clear that there were periods where this was only leading to greater. I mean, it's even the financial markets shut down once in a while when things are going nuts. I mean, come on, people know there's times when you need to pull plugs. But anyway, you can use AI to it's weird. You can use it to detect certain things that they're exactly like what was seen before, and maybe to do a little generalizing. But one of the things I can't believe, I was talking to one of the big AI guys at Facebook, and he's like, we have no trouble detecting, deep fakes. When AI is used to change a video, then AI can detect that. What a surprise. But they could not detect very simple modifications of the Christchurch video, right? They couldn't do that quickly enough to block the uploading. And that's insane, that you can't even tell that something is like a slightly shorter or slightly longer version of something you've already decided is a bad thing, right? So I think that really shows that the kinds of limits that you're up against with the combinatorial complexity of these things.
Bharath, or any other responses on this question, how much of the platform moderation is AI or human decision?
Yeah, I mean, if I can make a kind of broad comment on how this works. So working with a few colleagues at the Oxford Internet Institute and Voxpol about a year ago, we put together this kind of big review of all of the different kinds of techniques that were being used and what are some of the politics of doing that. And if we look at the large platforms like Facebook, like Twitter, like YouTube, what we tend to see is that they typically have an AI system that starts pulling things in, and then it triages it usually to human review. And as Joanna said, they have really big, and I mean, it's, as she said, it's not enough necessarily, but they are very big labor forces that do this work. It's highly damaging work. They don't get the same kind of salaries that engineers at Facebook get. But there is a large human labor force that's involved. But what we're seeing now is more and more of a tendency towards automation, especially as these kinds of technologies are developing more and more. So for example, detecting duplicate images to try to stop terrorist content like the Christchurch shooters content from spreading. But if we actually look at the processes behind how a lot of that works, it's really specific in terms of how much it's focused on specific kinds of extremism or specific cultures of extreme speech. And so what we have is this kind of, there is a broad machinery, there is a lot of this kind of triage happening where you use automated systems and then pass it over for human review. But there's, the bigger thing that's not always being discussed outside of some great academic work that's doing this is what kind of politics are behind all of that. And I hope that's something we can get into in a little bit.
Yeah.
I would like to say something. So I think over the last sort of few years, we've seen an expansion on the types of content to be moderated. So previously it was pornography and violence. And I think that AI catches more of that than the newer types that are being moderated. So from hate to now misleading content or dangerous speech or maybe even extreme speech. So these types are I think, less prone to being sort of automatically captured.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where the manuals come in, the guidebooks. And these, I don't know if you've seen Facebook's, but it's extremely complex. So what is it that is misleading? What is it that's dangerous? Or Twitter, et cetera. And so what we're now increasingly getting is less automation and more editorial. So this is like the automated epistemology are giving way to editorial epistemologies. And this is when you get into really complex judgment calls. Which then you will no longer be able to brag about, we caught 96%. No, you have to explain why it is that this particular case, this Trump tweet was removed and labeled, etc. So the wider we cast our net and the broader the definitions of that which needs to be moderated, the wider it gets, the harder it is for AI to take over.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Richard. We're planning to...
Can I just say quickly, I don't, it isn't that we just want, I mean, like I said, there's good reasons we prefer people not to have to see things and to somehow blur out so that if they could identify what they're pulling out. But it is about, we use AI to enhance humans who are doing this process. It is not, most people are not aiming to take humans entirely out of the loop. But we are trying to protect the humans, and we are trying to, sometimes reduce the number of humans, or to expand however many people you're willing to employ to expand what they can get done.
Thanks, Johanna. We're a bit behind schedule. We plan to screen a clip from The Social Dilemma, actually a Netflix film that has been released 2 days ago that is addressing a lot of these issues. We'll not screen this clip, but you can check it out, the full version even yourself. We'll jump right into the next video that we've prepared, and let me check that for you. And that's a short clip by, do we want to show the trap house thing, or saw it on the monitor? No, that must have been a mistake. So Ashat Akanbi, she's the next clip that we're gonna present. A lot of what we're saying here, of course, touches on this idea of free speech, also cancel culture. What is free speech, and to which extent should we defend it? Or when we should agree on some things that are excluded from this free speech. Aishat Akambi has a short clip called "The Importance of Free Speech."
We're living in a culture of fear, and as a result, freedom of speech is under threat. And people feel afraid to say what's on their mind, no matter how decently they put their positions. There's a problem. When people think questioning is violence, there's a problem. Because as soon as we say something is hatred, we stop listening. It's a tool to direct the conversation where we want it to go, where we are comfortable with. We need to be able to discern things that we find uncomfortable and things that are hateful. And we can only do that with some intellectual humility, with actually engaging with ideas and trying to see where people are coming from. We act as though disagreement is an affront to our belief system. We are limiting our own worldviews for our own comfort and for our own egos. We need to be challenged. Otherwise, we assume that we know everything and that there is nothing else to be said on something. And I would say that's the height of intellectual arrogance. We should be able to withstand critique, to withstand disagreement. We should also know that not all disagreement is rooted in some nefarious intention. Sometimes that's the way people learn. It's curiosity. To engage comprehensively in political discourse is quite a privilege. It does take a certain education. It does mean that you've read certain books. This isn't something that everybody has access to or is exposed to. Leaving free speech to the right is destructive, and it's counter to all our aims. We negate how much people want to be heard, how much people want to contribute. And if we're not allowing people to contribute because we are arrogant enough to think that only we hold the truth, we are pushing people away. We're fracturing our own bases, our own communities. And again, it's an intellectual arrogance we dislike, even more popular. When it comes to no platforming, I definitely understand the motivation. It's a motivation that is well intended because people care. People are fearful of what could happen when certain ideas are out in the public. However, I don't necessarily think no platforming for simply ideas that we dislike is helpful. You know, there's a difference between hateful ideas and ideas that make us uncomfortable. And I think we need to have the intellectual discernment to know the difference between the two. I don't think we should have the ability to say absolutely anything we want, because that would be to live in chaos. However, I think we should have a lot more scope for discussion than we do now. To limit free speech is only going to come back round to limit your free speech. Things that you believe are offensive on your side can also be used back against you. A lot of people that we now revere are the same people that we would tear down today. A lot of revolutionary types and a lot of people who've inspired great change and the people that influence us today, a lot of them wouldn't be able to exist under these conditions because we are completely unforgiving and completely divorced from what it means to be a human. In order for people to evolve, they have to make mistakes. In order for people to sharpen their ideas, they have to have some bad ones. We have to accept that people make mistakes, they're going to make mistakes, you make mistakes, and you wouldn't want to be judged by your worst moment. The mainstream media is often afraid to give a platform to a variety of voices. That's why platforms like Double Down News are really important to support. We need to be able to have a diversity of ideas, perspectives. As a result, support Double Down News on Patreon and join the future of journalism.
Okay. I think, yeah, this kind of brings us to the second part of this discussion. So we've been discussing a bit deplatforming and very much the technological aspects. Now it's more about our own human decisions, whether we want to cancel something or deplatform something, or accept something as was explained in this clip, as maybe that is uncomfortable for us to hear, but not maybe hatefully intended, and therefore we should engage in these discussions. And I think this also brings us very much to another aspect that she mentioned in her clip, which is the question of privilege. How much free speech is something that is easy to defend from people in a privileged position. Maybe we just give the floor to the speakers here. If there's anyone that wants to respond to this clip, Sahana, maybe you as the first, and Joanna also raises her hand. Maybe Sahana first.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think I really like this point about uncomfortable speech and hate speech. And this has to come with what she calls intellectual humility and not intellectual arrogance. And I think I take a step further and argue that this arrogance partly comes from the limitations and violence of liberal theory. For a long time, studies on the global north implicitly assumed that emotionality of hate speech is a sort of aberration that stands in contrast to calm rationality as a kind of default value of the post-war Western world, right? But when they looked at Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and other regions, the instant approach is to map them in terms of conflict and emotionally charged verbal cultures because of ethnic, religious, and caste divides. And that kind of, heuristic division between the North and the South and the accompanying conceptual construction of the rational center and emotional periphery is the root of liberal self-understanding and what she describes as intellectual arrogance. So in an ironic twist, in fact, the expansion of internet media has had some sort of an equalizing effect because there is some recognition that North America and Europe are no longer exceptional in terms of the violent emotionality of hate speech. So that's one point. But the second point that she brings up is also interesting. That's something that in our extreme speech project we are trying to do is to understand this cultural variation in terms of what is considered a polite and what is considered as civil is very different across societies. And that is also the intellectual humility, right? And from that, I think we need to go one step ahead and talk about empathetic understanding of online extreme speech actors. And the very word empathy can actually scandalize people. I've seen that happening. But among ethnographers, there's a very interesting debate on how do we understand understand the right. And I think there it is very important for our own research practices that we extend this empathetic understanding. And that's when we understand why these extreme speech practices come about. But more important, and this is my final point, that it is very correct that there is a contradiction between abuse as a kind of participation, political participation, because even in contexts like India, irreverent speech styles have upturned many established hierarchies. So, for instance, upper caste dominance coded in high language is attacked by colloquial styles of internet speech. And going back, rumor was used as a weapon for peasant rebellion in the colonies. That was not really civil discourse. Rumor is supposed to be exact opposite of it. But it helped peasant rebellion in the colonies. Or the way academic high priests are today questioned for their intellectual dishonesty. So all these, I think, this is the ambiguity of extreme speech that comes up very well in what she's saying. But I think even when we acknowledge this ambiguity, the question is what happens when abuse of intimidating nature interfaces larger structures of hegemonic power. And in many cases, it's not too difficult to understand. When there is a member of the ruling political party engaging in extreme speech, And it's a very clear case for deplatforming or taking any regulatory action. So there are many obvious cases that require deplatforming and other regulatory actions. But then you have to rescue other forms of ambiguous, irreverent speech styles.
Joanna, you also wanted to respond. Please go ahead.
Sure. Well, it's not a response. I'm absolutely loving listening to Sahana. So it's not a response to what she said, more as just another response to your question. When I was a professor, in British English, I was only a lecturer in computer science at University of Bath. Before Nigel Farage and UKIP, there was this thing called the British National Party that was the biggest racist jerks, right? But they got into the parliament, and then one of them was going to come and speak at my campus. Somebody had invited them, and there was this big meeting, and I went there to be on the side of, no, we can't possibly have this jerk here. And then there wasn't a single person in the room saying that we should. And I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. I'm at a university and not one person is saying, but wait a minute. I mean, they had more seats in parliament than the Greens did. I was like, would we also ban the Greens? I mean, what is an indication of legitimacy if you're not, okay, the Nazis are a great example of this, but I was like, who are we to judge this? At the same time, I don't want to fall into cultural relativism, and that's why I'm loving listening to Sahana. There are some absolutes, like for example, some people in, again, sorry to Ivy League it again, but Gary King at Harvard and Molly Roberts, I think they were the ones who wrote that. That was, anyway, it doesn't matter. It was another one of Gary King's papers, was that they tried to figure out what was the best predictor of when a state was going to collapse. What was the one thing that would best show you that a state would collapse? And it was infant mortality. When you can't keep your babies alive, then people are not going to, that's like the last thing. And so I think we ought to be able to detect what the difference is between the Greens, at least in a country like the UK, where the Greens are not actually violent. There are countries where the Greens are violent. But we ought to be able to tell the difference between the Greens and the BNP. There must be something. It may not be so trivial as, do they have a member of parliament? but there must be some way that we can find these measures.
Responses to what Sahana and Joanna said, or to the clip?
To the clip briefly. I mean, I think there's an assumption in the clip about that discourse is civil, rational, but when it becomes less civil, less rational, then what happens then? And of course we might become uncomfortable, but I think there are other sort of thresholds as well, and I think it's some speech makes one more than uncomfortable, and crosses some lines. That's one thing. The second point I wanted to make briefly is, I think the point in the clip about we shouldn't allow the right to take over the free speech notion. I mean, what's happening is the right is taking over a lot of notions, right? So it's taken over fake news, it's taken over the notion of cancel culture, and of course, with the free speech. And here, I think the question is about, re-entering those debates more robustly, with some uncomfortable speech, and as a question, as to how do you re-enter those spaces that have been mobilized and captured, or those terms that have been mobilized and captured by the right. So that was the second point I want to bring up.
And is it, I mean, you're raising the question, but would you want to do that with the same tactics and with the same kind of extreme speech, or to say, like, well, let me ask you two questions maybe. Why is it that the right can claim these areas or turn around these discussions and terms like fake news, like cancel culture, and why is that?
Generally speaking, it's a kind of propagandistic technique, right? You take the language of the other, and then you incorporate it and make it your own. I mean, it's something that we've seen historically many times. So it's a tactic. Mm-hmm. It's a rhetorical tactic. But no, I'm not suggesting that you fight extreme speech with extreme speech. I think that only brings the toxicity levels downward. But what I am advocating for is the consideration of robust, uncomfortable speech. Just as a follow-up to that, to the clip, I think that was a good point.
But the Aishat spoke about in her defense of uncomfortable speech, a kind of a throwaway line was like, well, no, none of us want hate speech. And then she went on to speak at length about what she was claiming to speak about. It seems to me that that's what the whole entire thing comes down to, is where that line is drawn and how it's drawn. And Sahana's concept of extreme speech maybe gives us some entry point into getting a little bit more of a nuanced appreciation of something that's very binary. It's either hateful or it's not. But it still, as Aishat says, then there's I can't remember the adjective that she used for the type of intellectual discussion. Sahana, you had picked up on that. It was a...
Intellectual arrogance?
Yeah, humility, intellectual humility. So how does one approach this issue then with humility? What exactly, how does that happen? How does that conversation proceed?
Well, extremely political correct speech also might be uncomfortable for others. There are different ways of creating discomfort or making the situation a bit uncomfortable in order to further the dialogue in ways which aren't just about civility. I mean, I think we're trying to find some. I mean, it's not battling extreme speech with extreme speech, but we're trying to find other language, other techniques, other ways to do counter speech.
Counter speech.
If I could jump in with a slightly different take, one of the things that bothers me a lot, especially in the digital domain, is that once we figure, we come to these answers and then we say, okay, we've got a good answer, then we come up with technology and we automate some part of the censoring or whatever. Who is it that then harnesses and deploys that technology, and how do they use it? Arguably, this stuff is a sideshow compared to the being able to get on top of, how do you handle elections or something like that. And I don't want to be, I don't want to marginalize that. Of course, it's people's lives, so I shouldn't call it a sideshow. But I do think that it is one of these concerns that hopefully, I don't think we can solve these problems without solving the larger problems of governance as well. And we know we won't perfectly solve those, and we know that we continuously make mistakes and allow governments to kill millions of their own people. It happened 120 times in the 20th century, and it's happening now. But we need to worry about that part too. We need to worry about the same tools that we use for what we hope is good, that they aren't then used to destroy things.
Can I just jump in here kind of quickly to bring a few of these strands together? Kind of coming to this point about intellectual humility, and also Sahana's point about how do we think about, when we're doing research on really problematic groups, racist groups and extremist groups, what kind of humility do we have towards them, right? And as someone who disagrees with that politically, it does make me angry, and I do feel anger towards those people, right? But I think it's really important to remember, I think, a pretty fundamental difference, and I think this ties in with what Joanna was saying just now, is, again, I don't like the idea that these people are being manipulated or they don't know what they're doing, right? That's not really satisfying or accurate. But I think what we have to understand is that there are structural processes that push forward this kind of extremism, right? Or push forward certain cultures of extreme speech. And there are people who get caught up in that, and they get caught up in that through their emotions, through all kinds of different processes. It doesn't mean that they're being secretly influenced, right? I'm not trying to suggest that. What I am trying to say is, we have to have humility for the people that get caught up in these things. We have to have a kind of forgiveness and a hospitality towards that. But at the same time, we also have to be really, really sharp in our critique of the people who have power, who use this in a way in order to further their own agendas, right? Mm-hmm. So, like, I'm an American, I'm super mad at loads of Trump supporters, right? But for me, the problem, right, is the media system that Trump is using in order to spread hate and propaganda in order to win his battles, right? And the ways in which companies like Facebook are profiting from his advertising on those platforms, right? So to me, I think what we need to do is say, okay, you know what, we need to accept that there's going to be some people who get caught up in these things, and we need to have the generosity towards them to say, okay, that, you can learn and you can improve and you can evolve. But to the people who are doing that for instrumental purposes, who are industrializing these kinds of processes, I think we can, draw a line. And I don't want to kind of take away from Sahana's idea that these are kind of situated cultures. But there is a certain point when you can tell someone is attacking dignity, someone is attacking the right of people to live free from fear simply because of their creed, the clothes that they choose to wear, or their skin color, right? It's once we've crossed that line, right, then we need to start talking about deplatforming. And it's not about deplatforming the people who get caught up in this. It's the people who are using this to make money and to win elections. And that's where it comes in, right? And that's where it ties in immediately with the political structures that Joanna and Sahana and Richard have been talking about today.
Well, wait, I'm not sure I would call that deplatforming. I would call that regulating, right? That's changing the laws.
Sorry, could you repeat, Joanna?
Oh, sorry. I don't know if I would call that, I loved what you just said, but I don't know if I would call it deplatforming. I would call that regulating. So when you're really going after like a business model, that's about creating law. It's about paying enough tax so that you can create laws, so that you can enforce the laws. And, it's hard.
Platforming is one piece of a much bigger puzzle. And that puzzle, absolutely has to be about regulation. But we're in this sort of kind of catch-22 situation is we need the regulations, which means we need to pass laws, but then those laws are then captured by the same structures that we're trying to regulate against, right?
Yeah, and so I think the only solution to that. We have some
questions also from the audience. So we have 8 minutes left. So if you don't mind, I would like to take a few questions from the audience. I think, Mark, you have selected a few of what we got.
Yeah, I have questions of my own, but I'll take the questions from the audience. All right, no, there's great questions from the audience, actually. One of the questions is for you, Bharath, but I think it actually is a question also more generally as well for all of our speakers. So the question is this. First, there's a little bit of a preamble. Many of the affordances of platforms that enable extreme speech conversely also enable more benign forms of activism and speaking to power. This is also a theme in the Social Dilemma. At the end of this documentary, Tristan Harris includes a quote from, I think it's like Buckminster Fuller, where he says that it's like utopia and oblivion sort of simultaneously. So I digress. If we should take a platform-centric view of combating extreme speech, how do we deal with the fact that these affordances can be used for both good and bad? Can they be designed to only work for good?
Well, I want to give some space to others to talk about that.
I think it's a question for more generally.
But I'm going to try to keep it quick. So I don't think we can design these things to be used for good. And what's coming to mind here is the philosopher Bernard Stiegler's idea of the internet as a pharmacon. Pharmacon is the idea that a particular material is both a remedy and a poison, right? And so that's what technology is, often going to put us in that situation. But the thing is, it's not necessarily about design choices. I think it's about regulatory choices. It's about the people and the principles that are applied in those situations at those companies. So that's kind of where I think it needs to go.
Can I do a quick, slightly Elon Musk thing, which was I was in a meeting that he funded where people were talking about having AI that would force you only to do the right thing. Basically they were saying it would stop you from doing the wrong thing. I'm like, what are you even talking about? How, society is something that's constantly self-improving. We can't, you're talking about eliminating human autonomy, right? So I think it's really important that what we do is we try to find ways to enhance who we are, to find ways that we can help improve our own society. The idea that there's going to be a savior machine that's going to sail in and just make and create a utopia. I had a postdoc from Poland that was looking at one of my talks and was very confused. And then she said, "Oh, I think in Polish there's not two words for utopia and dystopia. They're actually the same word."
I think we're in a dilemma now. We could either take one more question, because I think by now we have 4 minutes left, or maybe there's some statement that one of you wants to give. Maybe a question, Mark, before Ars Electronica pulls the plug on us.
Yeah, okay. Can deplatforming be seen as a valid solution for cancel culture? Who is the deplatforming for in the end? Those calling for cancellation, the platform itself, or others? I think a more general question that we have to establish, but I don't know that we're going to be able to accomplish this in the time we have, is what is cancel culture, and is it a thing? It's something that has emerged just very recently. Is this something that we can agree on as a kind of a coherent and legitimate concept? You spoke about this a moment ago as something that's a kind of a controversy that is currently being fought over.
To me, this word cancel, it's kind of metaphorical for like canceling a TV show. Like let's cancel, your broadcasting of your views, or and it's a term, I think, that people sort of understand kind of implicitly, or they feel it. It's not, I don't know how well defined it is, but it's a term that's becoming more and more popular, and it's being used increasingly on the right. I mean, it originated initially on the left, is being used more and more, and it is. I think deplatforming is a part of canceling, right? And there are other types of canceling, but it also could be subsumed under the larger. At least this is what Wikipedia does, under the larger header of sort of online shaming. These new practices of being shamed or silenced online.
Yeah, if I was going to say, and I'm not an expert, I'm dying to hear what Sahana has to say, but if I was going to say, I would say that shaming, that the cancel culture is sort of this weird herd, like this belief that it's your job and you've achieved something by when you shut something down through shaming or exclusion. And basically, I think that bullying and exclusion are problems, not solutions. But again, that goes back to this rationality thing. So like maybe it's an entitled thing of me to think that we're supposed to be able to have rational discussions and come up with regulatory solutions.
Because then I say 30 seconds of thanks. Sahana, maybe you have the closing word. Go ahead.
Who is this? Who are you talking to? Okay, me. Okay, so if it's me, then I would say yes. I would go back to what Bharath said. There are very clear cases, so they have to be approached with, a very, very strong-willed regulatory action. So we need to be very clear about it. And the rest of it is, if it is about some sort of irreverence that can stretch the boundaries in a useful way, in a way that nobody has a sort of dominance on the definition of civility, then I think we should allow. So this has to be understood in terms of what context we are looking at. So we would go back to a kind of grounded understanding of extreme speech. That's where I would end it.
Thank you so much, Sahana. I want to thank everybody also who's been involved this evening. It was a wonderful discussion. I think the beginning of a deeper discussion. I am very grateful for you all joining us this evening, and I would like to thank the audience for joining us at home as well. Thanks very much, and good night.
Thanks.
Thanks. I would like to thank Ars Electronica for actually offering us this platform. So thanks to all of you. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for the speakers, and see you at the next event at Impact.